Welcome once again to the vlog. I am your host. In case you're wondering, there's nothing wrong with the video. The screen tearing is just a thing that was prevalent on the Xbox versions of the game. Today, I'll be taking a look at Cris Tales on the Xbox Series X, which I played as part of my Xbox Game Pass subscription. It's also available on the Xbox Series S, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Windows PC, and Stadia. I'm just as surprised as you that Stadia still exists. Cris Tales is an interesting game, but I have some very mixed feelings about it. There are aspects that I really like, but there are also some things that I didn't care for at all. It's not a bad game, but it just feels like they rushed it out the door. In fact, I think if they can resolve some of the issues, that it could become a very good game. I know I'm going to come off as a bit harsh in the beginning, but I assure you it's not all bad news. It's just a bit frustrating for me because this game just had so much potential. I think with a little more polish, that Cris Tales could have been something really special. It took me about 26 to 27 hours to get to the end credits, and I did all the side quests. There are still a few achievements that I could earn, but I don't think I'll be coming back to it at its current state. Now, I guess they say that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Cris Tales is a turn based role playing game from Colombian developers who describe their game as a love letter to classic JRPGs. It's been wrongly called a JRPG by some, but it's pretty clear that the Republic of Colombia is in South America and it's not part of Japan. I know that this is just a semantical issue for some, but I think it's worth mentioning. For those that don't know, the J in JRPG stands for Japanese, so they are RPGs that can only come from Japan in a similar way that champagne is a sparkling wine that can only come from the Champagne region of France. Now, it's a very good looking game, but in trying to make it play like an RPG on the Super Nintendo, it also plays like an RPG on the Super Nintendo, which isn't always the greatest thing. Now, I love my Super Nintendo and my Nintendo as much as the next guy. I have hundreds of games for those systems, but in trying to imitate those games, it has some unnecessary quirks. The biggest problem with the game is that the difficulty is very unbalanced. The game is really hard at the beginning. Later on, it gets more reasonable before it gets really easy. Then, about halfway through, you have to start over with 2 new party members, and it gets really hard again. There are also various difficulty spikes in between until they sneak in a few major ones near the end. The final boss fight, in particular, is just ridiculous. The last boss has this attack that can one-shot your entire party. After some grinding and a little bit of luck, I was finally able to take him down, but I just hate that kind of thing. There are also these quick time based event attacks and defense system that doesn't really work all that well. The timing is just a bit off, and I think some of it may have to do with it being tied to the face buttons. Like, I know the SNES only had face buttons, but I think it probably would have worked better if it was tied to the triggers. Either way, it just doesn't work well at all, and this could just be an optimization issue that might get fixed in a later patch, and depending on your version, it might not be a problem at all. The game's gimmick is the ability to see in the past, present, and future. But in many ways, the game is just stuck in the past. It's something that's really important at the beginning, but it's kind of forgotten about later on. You do use it in battles and to solve some puzzles, and I did enjoy these sections. Also, there really isn't any good reason for the game not to have an autosave feature. Now, I know that the Super Nintendo didn't have it, but that's just because the hardware was originally released over 30 years ago, and it wasn't technologically possible. All modern systems are perfectly capable of autosave. I just know there will be lots of people who lose an hour or two because the game lacks a standard feature and become just really frustrated. Graphically, Cris Tales looks really good, and I really appreciate the aesthetic. I'm playing on the Xbox Series X, but for some reason the game suffered from screen tearing. From the opening cutscene, it's pretty obvious. They had to have known something was off because they had a patch ready a few days later that was about a third the size of the original download. I just don't understand why this fix wasn't ready before they shipped it out to customers. While we're talking about bugs, Cris Tales does have some pretty egregious ones, including a few game-breaking bugs. The Xbox version has this thing where the game loses connection to the controller. This can make it so you can't continue on in a few cutscenes. Removing and reinserting the batteries seems to temporarily solve the issue in most cases. However, it's been reported that the various console versions have a corrupted data bug that can cause you to lose your entire save file. The console versions accounts for 5 of the 7 versions of the game. Now, I didn't encounter any game-breaking bugs myself, but they're out there and I think it's worth mentioning. There are also a lot of loading screens. It's not a huge problem on the Xbox Series X, but I've heard it's a bit annoying on the Switch. On the Series X, load times are about a second or two, while the Switch has load screens that are about 10 to 20 seconds long. Considering that you enter a lot of random encounters, I could see this being a bit of a problem. If you have a newer console like the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S, or Xbox Series X, then you probably should go with one of those versions to avoid long load times. Which is kind of silly since this is such a simple game. I know they're trying to make a modern Super Nintendo game here with some of their design choices, but you couldn't exactly patch out bugs on a game made for the Super Nintendo. You also didn't have load times. So they had no problem taking all the bad stuff about a Super Nintendo game without taking some of the best parts about having a Super Nintendo game. I don't really care if you're a small independent developer or a giant multi-billion-dollar company. Releasing a game in this kind of state is just unacceptable in my opinion. If a friend asked me about the game, I'd say that for the most part, I really enjoyed it because Cris Bell is just incredibly charming and I was willing to work through a lot of its issues. However, if they asked me if they should spend $40 on this thing, my answer would be absolutely not because of its unacceptable game state. Paying customers shouldn't have to be the ones bug testing and optimizing a game. That's what playtesters are for, and Cris Tales sorely lacks sufficient playtesting and optimization. It's been out for a couple of weeks on the Xbox, and they've already had some pretty big patches, so maybe it will get better. I just don't know. Like, I understand that they're a small developer and releasing 7 versions of a game at the same time is really hard, but maybe they should have just concentrated on making one version of the game that works instead of releasing 7 versions that have major issues. Now, with all of that bad stuff out of the way, how could I have possibly enjoyed it? Honestly, despite it all, I still had fun. The protagonist, Cris is just a very charming character, and everything looks like it's out of a storybook. Cris is an adorable little orphan girl who meets a talking frog with a top hat named Matthias after he steals her rose. She later meets a boy named Wilhelm who tells her that she's a time mage. For some reason, he carries around a giant scythe like a pretty grim reaper. The third member of your party is named Christopher, who is a knight with elemental powers. With a giant sword that she couldn't reasonably lift, Cris goes on a quest to defeat the mysterious Time Empress and her minions, the Volcano Sisters, from destroying the world. The Volcano Sisters are pretty cool, even though one of them appears to be Donald ducking it. Like, I know that the Amazons were said to fight topless, but the bottomless look is definitely new. Not that I'm complaining or anything, but it's just a little surprising to see that in a game rated T for teen. I don't want to give too much away, but when you learn more about the sisters throughout the game, I became pretty invested in them. Throughout the game, you meet a bunch of really fun characters, like a giant statue lady, and float around in her giant shoe. About halfway through, you have 2 new additional characters who join your party. An extremely positive girl named Zaz, who fights enemies with the power of gambling, and an android named JKR721, or K for short, who punches enemies and he might accidentally explode if you're not careful. Near the final boss, you get one more character who is a mage who traps enemies in cards. I don't want to reveal too much more about her, but she's pretty cute too. The game is just so charming that it kept me playing until the end in spite of its issues. The story is fine even though it gets into a time travel nonsense trap, but it's the characters and the setting that really hooked me. For the most part, it's just fun wandering around and fighting enemies. Outside of the frustrating bits, it's a pretty chill experience. If you do decide to play it and get stuck, my advice is to just grind a couple of levels and try again. Maybe by the time they release the Apple Macintosh version, they'll have fixed all of the bugs and made the game a little more balanced. As it is now, there will probably be a lot of people who get to the final boss and not be able to complete the game. Heck, the first boss is giving people a lot of trouble, and you can't exactly grind your way to beat that one. At the time of this review, less than 0.5% of people have beaten the game on Xbox. Now, I like a good challenge, but I like a fair challenge with tight controls like Ninja Gaiden, as opposed to Cris Tales with its loose controls and cheap deaths. So while there's a whole lot about Cris Tales that I like, it's just not ready for prime time, which is really unfortunate. I think it could still become a really good game once they iron it all out of it, but you only get one chance to make a first impression. Unfortunately for me, my first impression of the game was a giant screen tear in the introduction. I want to thank you for watching my video, and I just want to remind you that these are just my thoughts and my opinions based on my experience. I played this as part of my Xbox Game Pass subscription, of which I paid the prevailing rate, and this should not be considered an endorsement of the aforementioned product. Now, have you played Cris Tales? If so, what are your thoughts? Do you think I was a little too hard on it? I mean, I liked it, but it could have been so much better. I want to thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.